Yeah.
All right. Good afternoon, or if you're in New York, good evening. It's wonderful to see you all. I am very happy and honored to introduce my good friend Chikyo, Ewan Magie. Chikyo, I know through Seattle Soto Zen. Chikyo is a Soto Zen priest training under the supervision of his teacher, Reverend Noman Tim Burnett, the guiding teacher at Red Cedar Zen in Bellingham. He practiced Buddhism for many years, decades, including resident practice periods, and has served as a key member of the Seattle Soto Zen community, where I have known him for a number of years. He is professor of English at Morgan Community College in Fort Morgan, Colorado, and is an active priest with the Prairie Mountain Zen Center. Welcome, Chikyo.
Thank you, Junda-san. Thank you, Cynthia. Wonderful to be here today. Thank you all for having me. And I just have to cheers to you, Selwood Soto Zen. It's wonderful to meet all of you here on the Zoom screen and to just feel your warmth. I really feel it, just all your hellos and waves. And it's really incredibly heartening, I have to say. Um, just connecting to Jundo's last point about practicing as assistant priest with Prairie Mountain Zen Center here. It's based in Longmont, Colorado, and I'm coming to you today from my partner's house in Lakewood, Western Denver. Um, but the Prairie Mountain Zen has not had a Zendo since the pandemic. We had to let go of that physical space and haven't had one since. This is a pretty familiar story, I think, for a lot of us in the greater Zen world in North America and around the world. And so it's an additional challenge to meet and to connect with one another, uh, heart to heart, Buddha to Buddha, as our tradition encourages us to do. Um, so it's a great pleasure to be here and to meet all of you and to feel your warmth. It's coming straight through whatever airwaves we call this Zoom thing. To me here in Lakewood, it's funny to me that it's actually cooler here than in Portland, Oregon. We have some clouds in Western Denver over the foothills, and it's a nice respite from the heat. Some more details. Uh, so yes, I practice with Jodo Cliff Clusen, who's the founding teacher of Prairie Mountain Zen Center in here in Colorado, and I spent more than a decade at Seattle Soto Zen under the direction of Eiko Jeff Kelly, who had come from Clouds and Water in St. Paul, Minnesota, when founding teacher Sandy Taylor had to go back to the Bay Area around 2009, 2010. And I took Jukai with Eiko in 2013, 14. And because of its location, Seattle Soto Zen in the Pacific Northwest, I have practiced along with Zogetsu Norman Fisher, and I did ordain with Noman Tim. My actual current teacher is Shinman Michael Newton at Mountain Rain Zen in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And I practice with Shinman Michael and his wife, Myoshin Kate McCandless, up there in BC when I can get there. Um, I am at home in the Suzuki Roshi lineage and really feel the family feel that pervades all the way from Rinso Inn to San Francisco Zen Center to Soto Zen temples like Selwood and Seattle and Prairie Mountain. Uh, Today, I'd like to talk about vulnerability in Zen, practicing being upright in community. And so the first sort of anecdotal thing I want to say about about this vulnerability in Zen is an anecdotal story I read long ago in the Seattle Times about courage. Because often when we go into a Zendo, we see a bunch of monks or people all in black sitting upright and they look impervious, unmovable, um, like they're wearing bulletproof vests or something. And it's really not that, actually, as you probably all know, that we're all opening ourselves with our hearts and the posture of the Buddha as we take every day opens us, right? Opens us with our whole heart in this unprotected area of our physical body. So physically, it's open and grounded on the earth at the same time, but it's also then emotionally open. And when we sit, all things arise. So back to this story in the Seattle Times, it was more of what you call a personal interest story, where the sports reporter had gone on winter holiday to ski in the Alps in France and had had a long day skiing in what we would call the backcountry and was really tired and kind of didn't know the way down but really needed to get down before it got dark and suddenly found himself at the top of this steep slope full of bumpy moguls, and some previous skier had seen this and written courage in the snow with a ski pole, meaning courage to you who have to get home this deep, steep, difficult run. And I know you can do it. And so it's with that spirit of courage that I kind of want to think about and reflect on vulnerability in our practice. So to practice the Buddha way is to practice being vulnerable as as kind of peaceful spiritual warriors. So maybe that's more what we can think of when we walk into the temple and we see all these sort of immovable looking monks and nuns in their black robes. They're not at a funeral, they're just wearing these garden outfits like Japanese farmers, and they're down to earth people like you and me. And so when we walk in, we often don't think, oh, now I'm going to be vulnerable. Rather, we're focused on our bowing, taking our seat on our cushion, and sitting upright in the correct Buddha posture, as instructed by Eihei Dogen in the Fukan Zazengi in medieval Japan, a description of how to sit zazen in roughly 1231. So in our Soto Zen lineage, we draw a connection straight back to Dogen and straight up to us in our modern day. And in this posture, we keep in touch with our breath. We follow our breath and we let our attention settle in the hara, deep down that point, 2 inches below our navel, right down in the central core of our body, really with a sense of groundedness, helping us. And here we can deepen into equanimity. No matter what arises, this posture allows us to be fully present, whatever vulnerable things may arise in our consciousness. And so this is the essence of our practice in our body, heart, mind, all together, holistically. Yet it is important to remember that, as I mentioned, our posture is completely open with our most unprotected heart facing out to the world. And yes, we are grounded on the earth. And like the Buddha, we can touch the earth as our witness that we have the right and capacity to awaken. But as we do that, we are also opening ourselves to everything in our consciousness that we encounter in our lives, in our experiences, in our intimate relations, and out in society. And I'll talk about that as I go along today. And this really is radical practice, right? This thing that the Prince Gautama discovered 2,600 years ago under the Bodhi tree. And really, before he even came to the Buddha tree, he was really calling on his memory, right? The the future Buddha really had kind of a intuition that he had to leave his father's palace, which was highly protected. Here he was, the future king for a secular rule, in line to have all the power and in this protected place. But he's like, no, 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 I have to go. I have to go outside somehow and explore and learn and experience. And I think, while many of us, including myself, are not to the manner born, not born to be future kings or any king or queen or whatever, um, but we do want to go out there and to explore and to live our lives and have a real feeling for our own life on this earth. What is it going to be? Who am I going to be? How am I going to carry myself through this world? And so, in going out, um, the Buddha, of course, has these four important encounters, right? First, encountering a sick person. Somehow in the palace, no one was ever sick. But maybe, since they were privileged, ancient Indian people, maybe they did have general well-being more than the everyday people out in the streets. So he was shocked to have this encounter, right? A really sick person. Um, and so we can imagine how, as a young person, this would land, right? And then, second, a very, very ancient old person. Um, and again, we have to think, okay, this is kind of a hagiographical story, kind of mythical story, but if we can believe it, this sense of really ancient person again shocked the future Buddha. And then finally, he has an encounter with a corpse, bloated, covered with flies. Imagine kind of the most sort of shocking experience one could have, and that you weren't ready for it, coming around the corner somehow. And there it is, freshly in front of you in all its nakedness. So these really, I think we can understand, are vulnerable moments. And then he encounters a monk, because ancient India was replete with spiritual practitioners of many different traditions. And ultimately, Buddha is kind of a discoverer of a new tradition, but also kind of a synthesizer of what was current at the time. And seeing this monk shining and alive in the midst of this world full of tears, Buddha was like, I've got to do this. I've got to go on a spiritual quest, a spiritual journey. And this leads him onward. And yet, as we know from the story, he tries asceticism, gets down to one rice grain a day, and he's starving. He tries philosophical rumination. Nothing works. And in the midst of his despair and emaciated state, he's brought a bowl of porridge by a young girl along a river. And it's not only the porridge that restores his body, but it's the warmth of the gift of another caring human being that restores the future Buddha and allows him to continue being nourished. And this really, in some ways, I think is actually the first Sangha, this moment when, he's sort of been left behind by his other ascetics and he's kind of cast out. But she brings in this bowl, but also this human warmth and the sense that you can, with my hand-to-hand, Buddha-to-Buddha moment, restore yourself and go on with your journey. And so it's then that he falls into memory and has this aha, remembering a scene from his childhood where he's underneath a tree watching his father work the fields, and he remembers being upright and clear. And he says to himself, wow, maybe this is actually the practice that I've long needed to try and to cultivate as a practice. And that is what leads ultimately to Shakyamuni's awakening. So like that monk that he saw before he really took the journey, the Buddha understands that he has to find a way to comport himself through the world of tears, the everyday life that we walk even 2,600 years later. And I use that word comport because I think there really is a formality to taking an intentional effort um, in our spiritual journey that we will find a way, each of us, to journey um, to the core of our being and also how to conduct ourselves with one another in our intimate relations and in our social relations. And so, uh, all these heroic stories aside, right? Because the Buddha story really is kind of the story of this spiritual hero, right? So that can seem kind of distant. You may not have woken up today thinking, I'm a spiritual hero and I'm going to go out in the world. Maybe it was more humble than that, right? As it is for most of us. Like, where is that cup of coffee or that cup of tea? Uh, and so heroic stories aside, we know sort of intuitively and intimately and experientially that we are vulnerable, that we know that our limited self is afraid, it's full of vulnerabilities that can overwhelm us. And we depend both on the self that has to grow, but also on other human beings to navigate this world full of threats and wonders. Really, we are not like caribou, able to pop up several hours after birth and scamper around on the North Slope. We have to go through this long development to grow our large brain and to grow into the world and our capacities. And we're vulnerable during all this time. And so, in taking a personal turn, right, my vulnerability is fresh up this year, a year when I've returned to long-term relationship and to graduate school in the midst of working. I'm like, wow, this is challenging. How can I conduct myself in a way that's nourishing, but also, um, helpful and beneficial to the ones I love and the people I'm traveling with? How can I, in going out in the middle of all this, how can I carry myself, comport myself? And so it has been a year where I feel a lot of vulnerability. And here it's only the end of June. There's a lot more year to go, a lot more experiences of vulnerability ahead. And so uh, we inhabit a world in which we know there are systemic inequalities, right? That it may be due to race, class, and gender, right? It could be due to things that we're born with, that we're challenged by. Uh, but we navigate this world with what we have and who we are, and also through the encounters that we sustain through our experience. And so each of us has an experience of this world that is different, that is unique. But all of us are vulnerable not only to the limitations of ourselves and our families and our cultures, but also vulnerable to fear and misunderstanding that can happen as we go out into the world in particular. And these things can trigger us into reactivity and defensiveness before our efforts to calm and ground ourselves can manifest. So that's another way that we can be vulnerable, right? That something might arise suddenly before we're really able to say, oh no, wait a minute, I need to sit and meditate for half an hour before we have this situation. That doesn't, the world doesn't work like that, right? It's just spontaneous right now, live in present moment. Uh, and so these reactivities can come up, and even in our places of sanctuary, like in the home and amongst our family, they can come up in our work environment. They can come up in our extended family. They can come up in relation to friends. And of course, out in the world in chance encounters. Um, so I wanted to connect that to emotions, right? That Daniel Goleman worked with the Dalai Lama some years ago, and he put out a book called Destructive Emotions in 2003, I think it was. And it harnesses Tibetan Buddhist teachings along with modern psychology. And it charts a path to noticing and labeling powerful emotions, right? So these are the kinds of emotions that might manifest quite rapidly, right? One of the things that is noted in that book is that, and we hear it in Thich Nhat Hanh as well, that anger can flash very, very quickly. So we certainly don't have a moment to say, hey, time out, I'm going to meditate for half an hour before I let my anger come up, right? It just in a flash. And then how do we meet that? How can we work with that? Um, and fear similarly. And sometimes our fears are necessary. Like if we were crossing the street and suddenly there's a truck, there's a stimulus that happens that says, jump back. Before we can even generate those words, the adrenaline is pulling us back, hopefully, to save ourselves. So the fear is sometimes necessary. But sometimes fear, like in a social situation, can limit us, right? Limit how we can see and understand, but arise very, very quickly. Um, and so these emotions can be destructive, even in the midst of loving relationships, and also in our social and community settings. And so contrast that with, again, the opening image that I provided of life in the Zendo, where it might seem all of the monks are in line, everyone's tidy, they've got their robes on properly, as we were laughing about as we began today. Do I have my robes on right? Uh, and everything looks orderly. There's a scent of incense, maybe. There's stillness on the cushions and pervading the air. And so, this classic image of life inside a Zen temple can actually be potentially misleading because it can suggest that all the nun monk practitioners have somehow purged themselves of all emotion and reactivity, and that they are beyond all that, dwelling peacefully in the world forever. It can seem that these monks are untouchable and unmoved. Um, but this rather is a facile and deceptive image or portrait. And it does not really reveal what is often arising, the turmoil or chaos within that many of us face as we go through a life of practice. So, our posture in practice is not designed to repress emotion, but rather instead to open us to it completely, in full honesty, full vulnerability, and then practice grounding ourselves there in the midst of it. But this is easier said than done. As I see some of you smiling and nodding along, yes, this is easier said than done. And maybe it constitutes a whole life of practice, intentional spiritual commitment that can help us go on and take the next step and the next and the next, steadily going along. So, as I mentioned, in this year, I'm discovering vulnerability anew in my intimate relationship, in my graduate studies, and in my work environment, which became suddenly tumultuous just in April. And suddenly everyone at the college is stirred up like a hive of hornets. Oh my gosh, we need more students. And, panic is setting in, right? As enrollment numbers come ticking in, we need more of them. Um, and so vulnerability is heightened and out of the blue, seemingly. And so Zen practice is a place where we can enhance intimacy with our emotions, with what we are feeling, with what we are experiencing, opening us to their power and our interior vulnerability. And so, to work with these powerful emotions, Zen Buddhism is multifaceted, our practice, right? On the one hand, we cultivate the 16 Bodhisattva precepts. Those of you who have taken Jukai are familiar with taking the precepts, taking Jukai. or if you've ordained, you've recommitted to them again as a priest. And this also, our practice involves committing to the four great bodhisattva vows, which include the Eightfold Noble Path, the way. Um, and and all of this is to help us cultivate being upright, as Tinchin Reb Anderson expresses it in his book by that title, right? That we're cultivating this in our practice. And we chant the robe chant every morning, every day. We wrap ourselves in Buddha's robe. And I hasten to say that if you don't have a robe, if you don't have an okesa or what are they called? These other things we're all wearing today.
Rakusu.
Thank you. The R word. Yeah, the rakusus. Right. So even if you don't have one of these things with the Japanese name, right, that I forgot momentarily, you do the chant together. And so we wrap ourselves in the practice every day. And each morning, I like to say it in the morning. And that's where I come from, my tradition. We cultivate that robe chant right off the bat. And I've always thought that's appropriate because then it's a reminder and it's like, hey, I'm wearing the practice. It's that encompassing. And I have then when I do sew something with the help of other people who are better at sewing than I am, then I feel, oh, I have a reminder. Even seeing it on you all wearing your rakusus, it's a reminder. Hey, we're practicing the Buddha way. And then we also have repentance vows, right? All my ancient twisted karma from beginning was greed, hate, and delusion. Born through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow. And we really allow ourselves to understand the non-self element, right? That we are more than just our solitary self, that we are connected into interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh calls it. And this is a great help, actually, when we are thinking about vulnerability. Because often when we reflect on or feel vulnerable, it's our own limited sense of self that is feeling that, not our Buddha nature. Our Buddha nature, our divine nature, you might say, is boundless, and we are, but much of the time, living from our limited self, our small self, which has sustained wounds and been hurt. And so that's one of the things that's so interesting about our practice is that both of those things coexist. And we really need the limited self in order to awaken to our boundless Buddha nature, because we can then really practice cultivating compassion with ourselves. Oh, look at how my limited self is vulnerable. I got stung by a bee. I stubbed my toe walking across the deck. I hurt in my heart because of something I said to my loved one, and I want to take it back. That vulnerability is the vulnerability of our limited self, the sense of that self that makes mistakes, that gets hurt, and so in many ways that I'm encouraging us to cultivate a loving, kind, and compassionate view towards our vulnerable, limited self, each ourselves and one another. So even when we're sitting zazen, we can have a sense of this vulnerability, or it might happen when the bell ends and we bow and we're walking with one another, and maybe we have a stumbling moment, or maybe we step on our Dharma sister's robe and we trip them up, and we have a trip up in the middle of the zendo. I've never really seen this, but it could happen, it really could happen. And then all these feelings would crop up like, you did that deliberately. No, you didn't. No, yeah, you did. And you can imagine, especially if we're in a sesshin and we're tired, because we're doing the schedule and we had to get up at 3 a.m. or whatever, and we're exhausted, and then we step on someone's robe and the flash of anger. And they're like, why did you step on my robe? Why did you take the gloves that were sent to me? That did happen in Tassajara when it was so cold. And my Dharma sister was supposed to get the gloves, but the other Dharma sister took them. And oh, there was so much hurt over this pair of gloves in the middle of the deep winter cold. So, how do we practice with these raw emotions that come up in the midst of our vulnerable self? Well, I have this book by Diane Rossetto here as a memory jogger, Deep Hope. This came out just a few years ago. This lovely book, Deep Hope. Diane Rossetto is a Zen teacher, and she also wrote Waking Up to What You Do. Waking Up to What You Do is really about the precepts, and this more recent book, Deep Hope, from 2019, is about the paramitas, or practices of perfection. And one of the things I love about Diane Rossetto, who I have never met, is that she really writes these for us, people out in the world, lay people in everyday lives and everyday careers, everyday relationships. So her teaching is always to help us who are facing into the world, right? We may go temporarily to a retreat center or a monastery, but we're really living in the world with all of the responsibilities of family and kids and work and commuting. And so her work is not written so much for being in a protected enclave, right? But really for those of us out there and exposed. Um, and so I wanted to reflect a little bit about dana, about the first paramita, dana, paramita, generosity. And often we think about this paramita as the giving we do to the temple, right? And there'll be a moment at the end of the time when we call for dana and people donate to support the temple with funds. And all spiritual temples do this in one way or another. But in this respect, I want to think about generosity, or dana paramita, is the generosity that we give to ourselves when emotions arise, and that we give to one another when we have our dialogical slip ups, like stepping on someone's robe or their heart, as it might be. Um, and so the generosity that we can give to ourselves when we make a mistake, but also to give grace to another who we love very deeply and with whom we share intimate relations, and sometimes the slip ups and trip ups that we make with one another. And so when we face directly into the storms and turmoil of human life, we can our practice strives to be wholeheartedly practical by giving us these tools to meet what arises. And this is really at the heart of Diane Rossetto's teaching, that it emphasizes the practice in the world with our parents, with our children, with our work, our friendships, and the wider complexities. And I see that there's a motion about time. So I'm going to have to cut this talk short because I didn't realize we were short on time with our chatter and greeting each other at the beginning. And so I just want to encourage all of you as I conclude uh, to cultivate just generosity with yourself. And really, this talk came up because I have my own really internalized, strong self-critic. And it's hard for me to cultivate self-compassion, self-love in the midst of reactivity. And so recognizing that we're all vulnerable and also trying to practice generosity with ourselves and practice not turning away, as Susan Moon puts it in her book title, that we can meet this deep vulnerability with the utmost and deepest generosity we can muster. At each moment we bow, each moment we greet one another, we can remember, I'm going to be generous with myself and with her and with him. So, final paragraph, Steve. Practicing this way, we open ourselves in this intimate relationship and in our communities being upright, not in some rigid and defended way or posture, but spacious and gentle, vulnerable and compassionate, a loving posture that's fully and wonderfully flexible and commodious, like the big mind that we think about when we think about Zen mind. And then we will really be practicing with that prajna paramita, that final conclusive paramita that runs through them all like a shuttle through the weave. And we are woven together with each of the practices of perfection, cultivating them just as we cultivate this practice with one another. So I encourage you to practice this generosity in the midst of your vulnerability with all the boundless generosity in your hearts, and bow in community with your complete open vulnerability, with all the love and compassion in your heart. Thank you.